Hi guys, welcome back. I'm going to be doing a technique video again for you this week. And I'm going to be covering a topic that I have had requested so many times in the past months that I don't even know anymore. And that is basically how to base figures, because I don't show how to do that normally in my videos. I prefer really just to keep those about painting the model only, because I think basing is kind of a separate thing. So I'm just going to be showing you the technique that I use most of the time when I am doing models. And I'm going to first show you sort of my generic standard sort of basing method, which is what I do on kind of something like, I don't know, 90% of my figures. And it's good for most situations and most applications and when you want to really just get something on the table pretty quickly. And then I'm going to be showing you several variants on that if you want to, get a little bit more interesting and a little bit more different. So in order to show you my basing techniques, I thought it would be best if I demonstrated on some, actual figures, and therefore I have picked out some guys from some of my earlier painting tutorials that need to have bases. First of all, I'm going to show you, as I said, just my general sort of all-purpose basing, which I use on most figures, and it's really kind of going to be sort of this just grassy, green, deciduous sort of plain, and I'm going to be showing you that on my Lands Connect here. And yeah, so this kind of base will look good on pretty much any figure and will fit in with pretty much any wargaming table, and so that's why you're probably going to want to be doing it most of the time. After that, I'm going to show you some other types of sort of variations to give you kind of sort of a different look or feel, allow you to set your sort of figure in a different environment. So I'm then going to show you on my Pyrrhus figure here how you can do sort of a kind of an arid, dry, dusty environment for your figure. And this is going to be suitable, obviously, for ancients, for example, or a good example, any sort of area around the Mediterranean, North Africa region. Yeah, basically any figures you would expect to be fighting in a dry climate. After that, I am going to be showing you how to do sort of a forest, sort of a more densely planted area. Well, just where there would be a lot of plants and undergrowth and, stuff like that. And I'm going to be showing you that on this commando from Vietnam, because I think he's appropriate for that. And indeed, this is a good base for any sort of like more guerrilla or sort of skirmish type figures. So I can think like maybe ACW, AWI figures you might have would be good on this base, or the obvious thing, of course, Native Americans you might expect to find in sort of a forest environment, so they would be good for this. So yeah, this base is going to be a little bit more complicated and maybe has less figures that look good on it, but it's a fun one to make. I'm then going to show you how to do a kind of a muddy, mucky base. So, something very it could be sort of something brackish, sort of fighting on swampy terrain, or just fighting in the mud. And there's a lot of battles where this is useful. I'm going to be showing you on my sort of retreating Napoleonic figure here. So, I mean, obviously, retreat from Moscow would be a good place to use this. World War I would be a great place for this style of base, or maybe even Middle Ages, like say a mighty battlefield like Agincourt would be a good one for this. And I really like making muddy bases. They're just a ton of fun, and you'll see why in a little bit. And then finally, I'm going to be showing you how to do a kind of a wintry base. To be fair, there's a little bit of overlap between this and the muddy base, but the wintry base is just a little bit more dry. But this one is going to be really cold looking. There's going to be snow, ice kind of look to it. This would be good, obviously, anytime you're fighting the cold. So, again, retreat from Moscow, the Napoleonic Wars. Also, obviously, a great many World War II things like the Russian front would be good with this type of base. I have chosen here, in fact, to use a Viking for that type of base, because really what's more appropriate with ice and snow than a Viking figure. So you may have noticed that all the basing styles that I just described are really sort of for outdoor kind of organic terrain, and I didn't really cover inorganic or sort of man-made surfaces, like if you wanted to put your figure in the middle of the street or in a pile of rubble or inside on a wooden floor or whatever like that. The reason I'm not going to be covering those for you today is because I think they're somewhat different from making organic bases. I think they're more complicated generally a good inorganic sort of man-made base takes a lot more sculpting, a lot more fabrication. You often have to remove your figure from its metal base to make them look good. And it's actually quite a bit of a pain, I think. And certainly if you're trying to quickly get a whole army on bases, inorganic basing or, you know, using man-made surfaces for your base is a lot more trouble. And the other thing about them too, I think, is they're not as widely useful. I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, a whole bunch of, you know, World War II airborne guys based on a ruined street scene sort of looks awesome by itself, or if you've got the right terrain for that. But if, you know, you go over to a friend's house and you're playing on a green felt mat, all of a sudden that's going to look a little bit weird, you know? So, you know, that's why I think like 90% of the time just choosing a more outdoor natural base is going to look better in more different situations, and it's just going to save you quite a bit of trouble, I think, in the long run. But, you know, I know there are situations when you do want that sort of man-made look, and if this proves to be a popular video, I will maybe do another one later where I sort of go over techniques for the sort of man-made surfaces. But right now, let's just keep it reasonably easy by sticking to these, you know, these more natural surfaces. Alright, so I'm going to show you my sort of basic standard default technique to start out with here. The first thing I always do is apply a mixture of thinned down PVA glue all over the base. It's sort of 50-50 mixture of water and basically wood glue. And then I'm going to dip my model in sort of a gravel sand mix. This is a model railway ballast mixed with a finer sand. I just run the base through it and sort of make sure it's all covered. Then I touch up any spots where the coverage wasn't good enough. Now before continuing on, you really want to let that gravel sand mixture dry on there, because it's going to tend to want to come off anyway when you paint it, but it needs to dry at least half a day, I'd say. So that's where the whole kind of having to wait a lot in this process comes in. But anyway, once you're done, it's time to base coat everything with a, you know, sort of a brown paint. And I'm using Vallejo paints here, just because you'll recognize the colors. But if you're going to do a lot of these guys, I recommend you get like acrylic artist paints, because they're actually going to be a better value and just more useful for this kind of thing. So you want to just dab that paint everywhere as lightly as you can, trying not to disrupt the substrate layer you've applied and sort of knock it off any more than necessary. And then again, you're going to really want to let that paint dry, because that base coat of paint layer will actually, once it dries, sort of help further stick down the sand and make it nice and hard and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So give that another several hours at least to dry before proceeding. And now what we're going to do is we're going to be dry brushing the model. And as you may or may not do, I haven't done much dry brushing before, but it basically involves putting some paint on your brush and then really vigorously removing it, wiping almost all of it off on a paper towel, and then sort of lightly running it over the surface. And you should use a much lighter color generally than the base that you're dry brushing over to get basically sufficient contrast here. So I often do two dry brush layers. In this case, I'm going to start out with a dry brush of beige brown onto this color, and then I am going to follow that with a lighter and more subtle dry brush of Iraqi sand. And sounds like it's a very light color, but when you're dry brushing, you really need this high contrast to get everything to really show up correctly. Now we're going to apply grass to the model. I'm using a product here that's called Static Grass, and it's used for a lot of hobby and modeling applications for railroading and also just for basing models. You can buy it from most big war game hobby supply type companies like Army Painter, Citadel makes it, and it comes in a lot of different colors. I keep mine in a great big bin here, and I'm using kind of a neutral medium color. And I'm going to apply that thin PVA glue again to my base where I want the grass to be. Remember that static grass the patches will be a lot bigger generally than the patches of glue you put down, so you should always be conservative with the size of your glue dots on your base if you don't want the whole thing to be covered in grass. So I'm just going to put those spots down, and I'm going to rummage through the grass with the whole base and then bang it off real good on the edge to get my grass to stick. Now at this point the figure is basically done, and especially if you're going to be doing a whole bunch of these guys at once, you're probably going to want to leave many of them just like this, with some amount of sort of static grass stuck on them, some amount of sort of dirt showing, and that's it. But you can also choose to add some grass tufts to the base to make it more interesting, and that's sort of a product which is made by various companies, also again Citadel and Army Painter, the ones that come to mind. They come also in a lot of different colors. I'm using sort of a neutral sort of plains color here, and I'm just going to take dabs of super glue and put them where I want my static grass clumps to be, and then I am going to just press them down with my fingers, or you can use tweezers or something sharp to position them. You could even get these kind of tufts, which I really like, which have flowers on them too, and they come in a whole bunch of different colors, and those are really nice if you want to sort of liven up an otherwise maybe dull colored figure. Now for a few variations. I'm going to start all the figures after this in basically the same way. That is to say, I've applied that sort of sandy grit to the base and let that dry thoroughly before continuing. So for this first dry, arid Mediterranean base, I'm going to keep it pretty simple, but I'm going to start out by adding some rocks, because you kind of expect that terrain to be rocky. And as a general rule of thumb here, anytime you want to sort of add extra items to a base, you should probably do that before you continue with any kind of painting in pretty much all cases. And again, it's really simple here. I'm just using super glue here to stick down some really tiny pebbles that I've picked out, and I'm going to make some clumps here and there. I'm kind of being messy and sloppy about this. My experience with these pebbles is they generally take quite a bit of glue to get stuck, and they can be a little bit fiddly, so you may have to kind of mess around and reposition them a couple of times to get them where you want them to be. And now I'm going to apply a base coat of the figure, and obviously we want it to be a much lighter color than before to get that sort of dry, dusty, arid look. The color that I've chosen in this case to use is Middlestone from Vallejo. So I'm just going to go ahead and slather that all over the whole base area. Now, once that's dried really thoroughly, again, I'm going to start dry brushing. The first shade that I'm going to use on this figure is going to be Vallejo Khaki, and I'm going to put that on pretty generously all over the entire base area. And then I'm going to add a second dry brush, this time of dark sand, which is kind of a lightish yellow shade. And I'm just going to be a little more gentle in applying this color than I was with the khaki. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and paint the rocks. You can just leave them the same sort of color as everything else, but I like to make them stand out a little bit. But I also want them to have sort of a dry, dusty palette like the rest of the base, but just be slightly different. So I'm going to give them a base coat here of the Vallejo brown sand. And now I'm going to continue dry brushing the base, because I decided after I'd finished it just wasn't as light and looking as I really wanted it to be for the kind of environment I was trying to simulate. So I am now actually going to be dry brushing all over with, very lightly, I should say, with first a bit of Iraqi sand, and then also just some pure white. And when you're applying white, you should definitely go very, very easy so that it doesn't get too heavy on your figure. And by the way, you notice I made some mess on the model's boots. Don't worry if that happens too much, because that usually looks kind of good. It looks like the boots are a little dusty or whatever, and it helps it blend in the background. Then I'm going to do a little bit more highlighting on the rocks. I got a little impatient. Normally you should let the rocks dry thoroughly before you try to dry brush them, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm just taking some Iraqi sand here first and kind of going over the rocks with it to kind of lighten, especially the top surfaces up. And then again, I'm going to pick them out even further with just some white. And when you're dry brushing rocks like this, you just want to have a very light touch and sort of focus on the top surface of the rocks and sort of any sort of sharp edges or sort of lines sharper lines in the rocks to help sort of define them a little bit better. So at this point I feel maybe the base is a little bit, I don't know, too sparse looking, but I don't want to add some static grass to this because it'll make it look just too verdant for the environment that we're trying to recreate here. So instead, I'm just going to sparingly add a couple of tufts of sort of clump grass, sort of just in and around the rocks, sort of to simulate kind of dry grasses or plants that sort of would grow in this environment without it just being a full ground cover. So I think I'm using army painter tufts here, and I think I'm using swamp tufts. Basically what you want is sort of probably a green color tuft, but maybe a more browny green is what I would recommend for this, just to fit with the overall sort of dry look that we're trying to recreate. All right, now for my sort of forest jungle type base. I'm going to start out by adding some extra objects to the base. The first is I want to make it look like there's kind of a log, fallen piece of wood. And this is really easy to do. If you want these on your base, all you have to do is just pick up some sticks from outside, some twigs, you know, that are going to be about the right diameter, and then just sort of break or cut off some small pieces. And that's what I've done here. I've just taken a small piece of twig, and I'm going to be just gluing that down where I want a log. And then I'm also going to go ahead and add an extra pebble here too, just to make it more interesting, because the goal with this forest base is really to build up as much texture and sort of different surfaces on this little area as we can, because that gives it that really full, dense, forested look. Now I'm going to base coat everything, and for a forest environment, the soil is generally going to be pretty damp. It's going to be loamy. It's going to be rich. It's going to be, in general, it's going to be, in other words, it's going to be dark. It's going to be a very dark kind of earth, darker than the sort of my basic sort of meadowlands color. So for here, I'm using a base coat that's a mix of the leather brown and just black. So I've just made it way, way, way darker. And I'm just going to apply that everywhere pretty generously. And once that's really dry, I'm going to go ahead with dry brushing here. And again, since we want the earth here to look darker, you want to use darker dry brush colors and just don't lighten stuff up as much so that it retains that moist kind of look. So the first color I'm using to dry brush here is just going to be pure leather brown. So you can see that the effect that you get initially is quite subtle. And then I am going to move on and do a second dry brush layer of beige brown, sort of more lightly in some select areas. And now I'm going to paint the other elements on this base. So I'm going to be doing the rock, and I've decided I want the rock in my forest to be kind of a gray rock. So I am going to base coat it here with some neutral gray really, really quickly. Then I'm going to base coat my log as well, and I'm using German camouflage pale brown for this. The specific colors, I should say, when you're doing this don't really matter a whole lot. It's really just you want to pick out sort of things that you think are pleasing. For this, I wanted kind of just a dead, light, dried out wood effect, and that's what I'm going to use to paint sort of the outer part of the log, and then the ends where it's broken off, because you know the inner part of a log, the inner wood of a tree is always kind of lighter. I am going to paint with Iraqi sand as the base coat. Now I'm going to be dry brushing those extra elements. So I'm just going to quickly do the rock by applying lightly some Vallejo Sky Gray, and then even more lightly I'm going to apply some just pure white. And if you get a little too much on when you're dry brushing, that'll happen sometimes. Don't worry about it too much. It's pretty easy. Just either wipe it off or just go back in with the first dry brush color and kind of cover over it and then just start anew. Now I'm going to do some dry brushing on the log. I'm going to start out here with a layer of the German camouflage pale brown with a bit of white mixed in, basically to lighten it up. So it's just the color I had before, but just slightly lighter. And I'm going to apply that
pretty heavily, just not really on the sides of the log in this case. And I didn't actually let the log dry here, so that's why the effect is not super good immediately. And then I'm going to go just back in with some pure white, and I'm going to use that to lightly dry brush the ends of the log because it's sufficiently light there that you can just go straight to white as a dry brush color and you don't need to do anything else. And then I'm going to go on and continue using the white to dry brush the top of the log this time, just to pick out any areas that are sticking out. Don't push too hard here because you don't want to make your log really white, but if you are careful, you'll get an effect that makes it look like sort of nice, weathered, old tree bark. Now I'm going to apply a bit of static grass to this base. Not too much here, just a few very small spots, because remember, in a woodland, grass doesn't usually grow very well because there's not really enough light for it. So if there's any grass at all, it's going to be patchy at best. So I just want to use a few spots of grass here and there because I want to get as much interest and texture as I said before, but we're going to build it up mostly with a lot of other things. Now we're going to start adding all sorts of foliage and growth and undergrowth and stuff to our base. The first thing I'm using here is clump foliage. It's sort of this kind of foam product, basically. It comes in different colors. I'm using a dark green one because that feels foresty, and you can just tear chunks off of it and use it when you want to build more substantial shrubbery and bushes and stuff. It's designed primarily for model railway hobbyists, and the stuff I use is by a company called Woodland Scenics. Indeed, they make, in general, a whole bunch of really nice things that are very useful, too, for wargamers. Anyway, so I've just taken a bit of it, and I'm just super gluing it down there onto the log, so it even covers the log a little bit, and then I'm just going to glue down another piece there as well nearby. Then I'm going to also glue on a flowered tuft, because I always feel like flowers and things are kind of what you expect in a verdant woodland, so I feel it kind of fits in nicely. And finally, what I'm going to be doing here is gluing on some things to simulate dried leaves, because obviously a forest floor usually has a lot of sort of fallen leaves that sort of form a layer everywhere, and that looks really nice. The product I'm using here, it's made from, I guess, I'm not sure exactly what it is. I think it's the sort of fine leaves of a certain kind of like small plant. I forget what the exact name of it is, but anyway, you can buy these leaves dried in bags. It's once again something I think they make available for a model railway hobbyist, but also for just model makers, like people who build dioramas and do 54mm and that kind of stuff. So anyway, I have a bag of these leaves, and what I've done here is I'm just applying patches of super glue where I want there to be leaves, and then I'm just sprinkling them kind of over that area and just letting them dry in order to get those areas. And so then you can see the finished effect. Now you have a lot of different textures, a lot of different looking kinds of plants and leaves and a log and everything. So I feel like it simulates the really kind of busy, kind of full feeling that you would get if you were sort of going through a forest. Now here I'm going to be making a kind of base that's good for figures who are kind of walking in a swampy environment or just through a really muddy, wet kind of battlefield where everything's really sloppy and messy. And again, as usual, I've started out by applying the grit and letting it dry, and then I'm base coating it. And I'm using the same base coat color here that I used before on the forest, so it's a mixture of the leather brown and the black, because of course it's mud, and mud is always going to be a very dark brown color. You know, that's how it gets when soil is wet. Once that's thoroughly dry, I'm going to apply a light dry brush here of just leather brown. Again, don't need to dry brush here very much because we're going to be doing something else and making a big mess with all the mud, so this is actually not particularly critical. Now I'm going to be making my mud. You can buy products from various companies, but I'm old school, so this is how I learned to do it. And I mix up create kind of a toxic mixture here, but I think it works really well. What I'm mixing here is some plastic cement, some plastic filler putty. So basically the products used for gluing and filling holes in plastic models, a bit of grit, and then some paint. I've got German camouflage black, brown, and leather brown in here, and that's what's going to give our mud a color. So basically what's happening here is that the plastic cement will act as a solvent for the plastic putty when you mix it all up and sort of thin it down. And so you're just going to want to stir it up, and you're going to kind of a gooey, muddy mess here, and you want it to be kind of as smooth as you can get it. And you may notice that it turns a little gray from the plastic cement. If that happens, just add more paint to get the color that you need. And if it's still too thick, add more plastic cement in and to thin it down a bit more. You want a consistency sort of like icing or fudge or something like that. So it's still thick and gooey and gloppy, but spreadable, and that you can work with it pretty easily. And I would not get my nose too close to this, because being it's plastic putty and it's plastic cement, it's going to give off some fairly intense fumes. So you can see what I'm just going to do now is I'm going to just take that toothpick and I'm going to start spreading this gloop all over the base, just to try to simulate the effect of kind of being in a muddy, kind of mushy, kind of, yeah, just walking through thick, gloopy mud, like you probably get actually in quite a few battlefields. And yeah, so I'm just going to glob that on. In this case, I'm going to cover pretty much the entire thing, and I'm going to you may even want to put it somewhat on the model's feet so that he's got mud all over his feet, or so it looks like he's really in it, you know. So yeah, I'm just going to apply this on, and this will take you need to give this a bit of time to dry. It needs an hour or two to dry at least, yeah. And then you can continue painting on it like you would any other surface. This stuff is, on little bases like this, is usually a little bit overblown, but it's really great on larger bases, or when you're doing vehicles like tanks or something. You want to smear this in your tank treads or around your wheels or something. This is great for muddying and mucking up your your vehicles and giving them a more natural look that blends them in better with their base. Now I'm going to just really lightly dry brush again using the leather brown. But remember, you don't want to dry brush here too much, because it's called dry brushing for a reason. It makes things look kind of dry and dusty. And obviously mud should not look dry and dusty. So that's why if you do a dry brush at all, you need to keep it really subtle. It's just more this very slight highlight. Now because this is fresh, gloopy, wet mud, you need to do something extra to make it look fresh and wet and gloopy. So that's really quite easily achieved. All you have to do is just kind of paint some gloss varnish over the areas of the mud to really make it look wet and shiny and fresh. So that's just what I'm doing here. Now you can leave it kind of like in the previous step if it's just an open muddy area, but if you want to look more like a swamp or a field where there's some plants growing, you can kind of add in some tufts. And I used here Army Painter sort of swamp type tufts. I just added a couple in here and there, and I decided that was okay, but I felt like it still needed something extra. So then I took some of those little tiny miniature leaves that I used in the forest tutorial, and I then added those in as well in a few places, just to add a little bit more detail and a little more texture to the overall surface. And now finally I'm going to show you how to do sort of a wintry snow type base. As usual, I'm starting off here with the dried grit, and I'm going to be gluing on just a few rocks here just to get a sort of little bit more interesting surface to work from. And you can see I'm making a little sort of pile of rocks next to his foot in this case. And when those are well dried, I'm going to go ahead and base coat everything, and I'm again using the color I've used in the last two, so a mixture of black and leather brown, because I want the soil to be dark, because in the winter time, under the snow, the soil is usually wet, it's full of moisture very often, and sort of dark, it kind of gets frozen, so I think you generally for a wintertime scene, you want this sort of dark brown. And now I'm going to dry brush, and I'm going to be using the same colors I used before with this dark shade, the same color combination. So I'm going to start out here with just some leather brown everywhere as my first dry brush color, and then I'm going to go back over that with the beige brown color just to lighten it up a little bit. And now I'm going to go ahead and paint the rocks. I'm going to use the same colors that I used for the rocks in my forest tutorial. So I'm going to base coat them in neutral gray, like I did before. And then once that's gotten a little chance to dry, I'm going to add a dry brush quickly of the sky gray, followed by a bit of white, just to very lightly accent the sort of the edges and make them really stand out. I'm now going to add some very small patches of static grass, not too much, but it's nice here because I made a couple boo-boos where there were areas where the grit wasn't really covering all that well, or I just dry brushed too heavily, so I want to cover those up. And that's one nice thing to remember. If you make mistakes with your basing, static grass can just cover up areas that you don't like. But anyway, you may say, why am I putting grass on a winter base? It's going to be all snowy. Well, yeah, it is, but there's still grass under the snow, and that can show in some places, and we're going to build this up in the same way as it happens in nature. So we're going to start with the underlayer first, and there's going to be a little grass under there. I also thought it would be nice to add a couple of tufts, just so you have, because sometimes you get like snow and you have long grass that sort of pokes up through this snow plant material. I am using dry, dead grass tufts from Army Painter this time, so they're very clearly brown because it's the winter time and all the plants are going to be dead, so that's what you want here. And now I'm going to finally add the snow, and we're doing this just like you would with real snow. It's like we made a base and then the snow fell on top of it and covered everything up. It's actually pretty logical. Of course, to get your snow to stick, you need to apply some glue, and I'm just using the PVA for that. Again, I'm going to be putting on pretty much all of the base, even over those tufts, because especially wet snow will stick onto plants, so you want there to be glue there so that you'll get your snow where you want it. Once I've applied that, I'm just going to take this snow powder, which I'm not sure what the material is. I think it's very fine plastic grounds, or maybe glass, some synthetic product like that. I'm not sure. Anyway, you just take it and you sprinkle it all over the area where you want snow. You can even build up layers if you let one dry. And the effect it gives, it looks very much like, especially like very sort of fresh, wet snow, like you get when it's kind of warm. It doesn't look like really hard, built up snow banks. If you want that, you're probably going to want to really sculpt sort of a base for the snow before you cover it with this product, if you want real drifts. But this is great if you just want the effect that looks like there's been sort of a lighter sort of snow that's just fallen and sort of semi-obscured, what's underneath. And I personally like that better because I think it's more interesting when you can see sort of those under layers. This product is, again, something that I think is used a lot by model railway hobbyists. Woodland Scenics carries a snow powder. I assume that other people do as well. I will link to where I found it in the description box. I have no idea where the bag I have came from because we've had it for years, but I'm pretty sure that the Woodland Scenics stuff is essentially the same. All right, and here you can see our 5 models all finished with their completed bases. And I was really happy pretty much with how all these figures turned out initially, but I never get tired of seeing just how much nicer figures get when you apply a base to them, what a difference it makes their overall appearance, and how it can really take good figures and make them great, and take kind of mediocre figures and make them better than they were before. So yeah, good basing cannot be underestimated. And anyway, this is the technique I use for basing. And as I said, the guy in the front, the Lands Connect, that sort of grassland thing, that's what I do 99% of the time. And the other things are kind of options. If you want to spend more time, want to put a little more effort, want to do something a little bit different, those are all options you can try, for certain themes or certain armies. This technique works really well too, I should point out, if you're doing a whole bunch of guys on bigger bases. The technique is very easy to automate. It's easy to do a whole bunch of guys at once. It's a pretty fast process, really. The amount of work you have to put in yourself is not very much. There is a fair amount of drying time involved. though, between putting the gravel down and then between waiting for the paint to try the base paint. Once you apply that, both of those take at least half a day probably of drying time. So if you're going to be painting an army and you need to have it down on a deadline, you should probably take that into account and start early enough that you have the time to get all of that done. So once again, hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found this useful. And if you did, please like it, share it, leave me comments, let me know what you liked, if you have other suggestions for people, or some ideas about where to get other cool basing products, or other things that you found out that you think work well for basing. So I think that's all for now, and I will see you next time.